This is my Module 5 presentation on emotional intelligence. I'm going to share my screen here real quick and present it. Okay, so emotional influences on learning, specifically talking about emotional intelligence. The first source that I used was by Kendra Sherry from The Very Well Mind, just a basic definition of emotional intelligence, being the ability to perceive, interpret, demonstrate, control, and use emotions to communicate with and relate to others effectively and constructively. Some examples listed in the article that stuck out to me of employing emotional intelligence was the ability to identify and describe what people were feeling, knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, having self-confidence and self-acceptance, which I thought was an interesting piece of emotional intelligence that I hadn't really thought about before. Another one is accepting change. I talk about this all the time in my classroom. Letting go of and accepting responsibility for mistakes. Another one that we hit hard quite frequently. One that I think relates directly to learning, especially after exploring some of the other sources available to me in the module, is a strong sense of curiosity about others and the world around you. Demonstrating empathy and sensitivity to others, and managing emotions through difficult situations. So here's some examples just based off of these examples right here on the bottom of this slide that I could think of that I do in my classroom right now that actively build emotional intelligence skills. The first one being interactive journaling. So I journal with my students every day. They have a prompt, and the expectation is that they write for 10 minutes. And I answer their journal prompt. Sometimes it's silly, sometimes it's goofy. Always every journal prompt asks them to reflect on themselves. So I think that really builds a sense of self, a sense of opinion, a sense of curiosity when they're forced to think critically about themselves and the world around them. Some students choose never to answer these prompts, but it's always an opportunity for growth that they have. I found that I have had to slow down and really teach my students, specifically my freshman students, how to actually work with each other and in small groups. They have walked in from a program in middle school that was primarily on the computer, and they did not have a lot of opportunity to intentionally interact with one another. And I can tell that their emotional intelligence is very, very low compared to some of the other grades at the school. And that's not a super fair comparison because a lot of growth does happen from year to year, especially in adolescence. But I just see this hyper reactivity that I haven't seen before. And I'm wondering if that may be a direct effect from COVID. So I try to provide many moments of intentional self-reflection about coursework, about other things like my journal prompts. We talk a lot, especially in some of my more advanced classes, we take the time to do peer feedback and peer reviews on papers. And I think it's important to learn how to give and receive structured feedback, even that if you completely disagree with that feedback. I write a lot of emotional regulation behavior plans, especially for some of my younger students who have some explosive, sometimes frequently violent tendencies. And we do a lot with teaching how to recognize when you might be getting worked up and how to kind of nip that in the butt or write it out. I do not use a seating chart, and I think that that actually builds a lot of emotional intelligence because I'm constantly having conversations with students about self-awareness, about moving to a different spot in the room if that particular spot is not working for them, and why that might be that it's not working for them. And I just see a lot of growth. It's a lot harder for me. It's not easy to not have a seating chart. Um, but in some ways it just puts so much more of the responsibility back on the students. Obviously there's some students that I have to intentionally seat away from each other, and sometimes it's not their choice to move or to sit in a certain location, but we always talk about why I might be making that choice for them. And I think that that's been a subtle but really like pivotal classroom management technique that I've used upon reflecting on this unit. And that goes hand in hand with learning how to self-monitor behavior. I try to do a lot of guiding conversations about correlating grades with academic performance and emotional regulation. So your grade your emotional regulation and your ability to move if you're bothered by the people around you or ask for help or self-reflect will be directly reflected in your grades and academic performance in some subtle and not so subtle ways. I also try to model healthy emotional transparency. So if I'm having a rough day or if I feel like I'm getting really frustrated or grumpy because I've had to correct a lot of behavior or I've had to repeat myself a lot, I try to model some proactive ways of talking about those feelings. So here's some questions for reflection and some more informal observations for my classroom. I think it's important to make time for all the previous strategies in my classroom environment because students are very quickly able to self-regulate when there's a structure or a known plan. So the plan is that if they're not focused and or if they're bothered, they are allowed to move. No questions asked. I put that in my sub plans too. Um, or I'll make that decision for them. And it places the responsibility completely back on the student and really like forces self-reflection in a heavy way. I also think it allows all these strategies allow for immense amounts of trust in the teacher-student relationship when I'm able to consistently show up and reinforce these strategies. So it shows consistency in behavior and expectation when it comes to talking about and feeling our emotions appropriately in the classroom. And it also eventually will allow space for consistent, effective time spent on academic materials. So when managing or de-escalating a behavioral situation, the classroom doesn't take 45 minutes anymore. We're able to spend a lot more time discussing academic material. One of my favorite essays that I share with my students at the beginning of the year talks about how all great academic work begins with an emotional reaction to something. So I think talking about behavioral management strategies opens up a conversation to talking about emotions in an academic context, just as like a baseline expectation. And that's not always a normal thing that happens or that they're used to. So here's some research supporting my observations just based off of the resources that were put out in this module. Emotional intelligence, I hit all 4 areas of emotional intelligence in terms of my classroom observations. The idea of identifying emotion in self and others, using emotion to facilitate thinking, understanding of emotion. We hit that hard with journal prompts, and management of emotion. We hit that hard with classroom procedure and individual behavior plans. I think it's really important to understand that emotional intelligence connects cognition with emotion. And these authors claim that emotions influence decision making, relationship building, and everyday behavior. And it's just when you're looking for emotional reactions, it's just so blatantly obvious in a classroom setting that cognition is sometimes purely impacted by emotions and reactions. I mentioned that one of my favorite things that I share with my students is that all good academic work begins with a genuine emotional reaction. And I think that this ties into some of the knowledge emotions article. And I think it's fascinating that knowledge emotions, as their name, surprise, interest, confusion, and awe are just everyday things that we experience pretty constantly. And I love watching this process happen with my students in terms of breakthrough moments when it comes to emotionally regulating their own selves, but also engaging with classroom material. The power of emotional intelligence discussed the fact that the brain is wired specifically to mirror the emotional state of other people. And I think that it's really important to understand that we're built to learn and implement compassionate practices because of this. If compassion is our brain's default, then I think it's really important to operate with compassion and like constant compassion in the classroom environment and to teach how to be a compassionate individual. Again, we experience the world first through our emotions, which is why building emotional intelligence is such a foundational skill. This is directly supported by this TED Talk. The next source, the heart-brain connection, emphasize focusing on a child's ability to regulate their emotions in order to see success in classroom situations. They mentioned that behavioral interventions are biological. This is a biological need that we have. just like eating and drinking and sleeping. Um, and then they opened up the conversation of correlating working memory and performance with anxiety, talking about just how much an anxiety producing environment can hinder an individual's ability to perform in any way or to create any kind of working memory, which is why it's so important to create and foster an environment in the classroom that leans on talking about emotions in a positive light. The next video, how emotions impact learning, they discussed the idea of anxiety further, saying that whenever presented with an anxious thought, we're completely narrowed down to either a fight, flight, or freeze response, which can be triggered by a lot of different things, especially in working with students who carry a lot of trauma with them into the classroom. Which is why I think going back to my strategy of having a behavior plan in place that encourages self-reflection and monitoring can help control a student as they experience these urges to fight, flight, or freeze when presented with a threat. They talked about engaging with positive emotions. So positive emotions like the awe and curiosity and wonder can broaden our thought action repertoire that builds our capacity to learn. And I thought that was a great quote. Engaging with awe allows us to engage with learning in a really profound way. And not only does it does it allow us to learn about the thing that we're in awe of, but it also subsequently builds our ability to continue to learn by noticing and leaning into that emotion. I think it's great, and I think part of the reason why I start with something like interactive journaling in my classroom is the idea that feeling good is the best fuel. So processing emotional reactions to things, setting up an engaging, positive, accepting environment in the classroom will only increase my students' ability to perform academically, where it used to be thought that that was the opposite, that we perform to feel good, but instead we should feel good in order to perform. And the last video just really emphasized the idea that stress and anxiety can be toxic to the brain. And while learning these procedures can be quite stressful to my students, I think that the result is a less stressful, less anxiety producing environment that is quite healthy for them to be in. Some of the questions that I have for future growth areas is I want to further reflect on how I'm intentionally fostering opportunities to engage with feelings of awe and curiosity in my classroom. I think I could do a lot more with that in terms of the way that we approach different literature, different poems, different stories. And I would also like to think about how I might strengthen my own approach to behavioral strategies in hopes of aligning those practices with my own expectations for my students. So I want to be even more intentional about some of the strategies that I implement for behavior changes, thinking about what's the end goal, what do I want them to walk out of my classroom knowing for next year, having practiced and learned and experienced. Because I think a lot of times I can get stuck in a rut of crisis management and lean on some old behavior routines where I could be doing more to help strengthen their individual emotional intelligence while they're in my room. All right, that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.